Who'll start me off? 300 I've got, 400 anywhere. Can go 100 for the Clark Electric at £300 only.
Under the hammer goes the last of Britain's state-owned shipyards. Despite its modern facilities, Sunderland was auctioned off last winter because the yard can't be sold for shipbuilding.
Next lot, there we are, is lot 2, 6 pneumatic grinders, £20 for them.
Over £60 million of recent taxpayer investment is going virtually at scrap prices. For a couple of former shop stewards, the unthinkable has become reality.
Don't believe it. £30, bloody hell.
Getting stuff for nothing. Getting stuff for nothing. Stuff that hasn't been even used. They're getting it for nothing. Vultures.
Number, sir?
It's the best in the world. You're just seeing it getting tore apart. And as I say, it's frightening.
Some of the best times of my life was spent here. But it's all gone now. Very sad, yeah.
The town's history was built on shipbuilding. The town's history is built on an industrialized river. I heard a news flash on a program as I drove down to the dock that something worth £900 had been sold for £30. This is what the British government have brought us to.
At the time of the auction, the local Labour MP was still waging his campaign for Sunderland, trying to discover why this yard had to be sacrificed in the government's privatisation. He's still perplexed and angry at what happened.
People need to come and see it to actually realise the scale and modernity and value of what has just been scattered and, in a lot of cases, almost sold for scrap. Other shipbuilders who were, in a sense, potentially competitors of this yard, but who were familiar with it, described it as an absolutely unique asset that the United Kingdom could not afford to lose.
The last hope for shipbuilding in Sunderland rode on these high-tech catamarans now on cross-channel ferry service. They're built by an English businessman eager to expand. But he can't build them in Sunderland, nobody can. The government, so set on privatising shipbuilding, will sell the yard, but not for the purpose of building ships.
It is absurd, really. It's absolutely stupid. Well, we could have bought it, of course. Don't get us wrong, we could have bought it. We couldn't have built ships in it. Could have done anything else but build ships in it.
Ironically, it was just when the market for new shipping was picking up that the government pushed ahead in getting rid of Sunderland, a policy mismatch that's baffled senior Tories.
Conservative governments have never come to grips with the difference between getting rid of something which is nationalised and the chance of transferring it to the market when somebody else might see a demand. It is a concern that government, in wanting to privatise something, also tends to want to get rid of it.
That's what happened to Sunderland, got rid of in the rush to privatise the rest of British shipbuilders. Sunderland's fate was settled in a deal between the Thatcher government, privatising to cut its losses, and the European Commission. The deal was the only way the Commission would approve all the state aid Britain was paying out to sweeten the privatisation. Much of the detail has remained secret until now, but tonight Panorama will reveal an extraordinary story of ideology, intrigue and incompetence that made shipbuilding, arguably, the privatisation that went too far. Britain's failing shipyards were rescued when the last Labour government nationalised them in 1977. But their subsidised losses, eventually totalling over £2 billion, kept mounting. By the mid-80s, the Conservatives started privatising them piecemeal, with Mrs. Thatcher's favourite, Graham Day, selling off the easy bits, the warship yards. Deprived of profitable defence contracts, that left state-owned British shipbuilders holding the heavily loss-making merchant yards. After more closures, there were only two major yards left, North East Shipbuilders in Sunderland and Govan on the Clyde. They were next in line for the privatisation treatment. To prepare them for market, a new man was appointed in '87 as British Shipbuilders chairman, the late John Lister. He was a senior man from ICI and had an affinity with the North East. Lister looked long and hard at British Shipbuilders' dismal commercial position, but was encouraged by projected growth in the shipping market.
I think within his first 6 months in office, he'd come to the conclusion that there was a sufficient improvement in the market to warrant remaining yard going. And having satisfied himself on that point, the next job was to work out a plan.
Lister put to the government a new corporate plan. It suggested taking 4 years to break even and only then privatising British shipbuilders. Crucially, he recommended keeping the yards together as a single cohesive unit. One yard on its own, he said, would not lead to a viable business unit. Lister was banking on an upturn in the shipping market, and central to his plan were the modern facilities at Sunderland. At the time, Lister wasn't Sunderland's only fan.
I named this ship Stena Seawell. May God bless her and all who sail in her.
Blessing, too, for a nationalised industry.
We are here in Sunderland. We're at Sunderland Shipbuilders. We've just built the latest technological, best vessel ever. There's nothing else like it in the world. It's been done here. It's a boost for this workforce. It's a boost for Britain. So let's shout that across the television screens too.
But Mrs. Thatcher was soon to do something which would undermine the Sunderland yard and destroy John Lister's plan.
Objectives of the Department of Trade and Industry, you read the next line.
After the '87 election, the Prime Minister put 2 new men into the Department of Trade and Industry. Lord Young and Kenneth Clarke were 2 cabinet ministers in a hurry and with a brief to get shot of the remaining nationalised industries.
That's the fellow! Enterprise Initiative.
Under Young and Clarke, the DTI was to be revolutionised. Out went the idea of subsidising sick industries, in came the idea of selling success and relaunching it as the Department for Enterprise. Young's memoirs devote over a dozen pages to the relaunch and the new logo, and 3 lines to the fate of British shipbuilders. The book also reveals something not known at the time, that on taking office, Lord Young made a private promise to Mrs. Thatcher. I told her that it was my ambition to dispose of all DTI's nationalised industries by Christmas 1988. To help meet that deadline, a buyer arrived from a surprising source. Unexpectedly, from the depths of winter in '88, the buyer interest came from an expanding shipbuilder called Kværner, who are one of Norway's big shipping groups. Kværner are also a world leader in high-tech design and construction of liquefied gas tankers. After closures in Norway because of high wages, they were in the market for cheaper foreign yards. Kværner wanted to build ships for their own fleet, and they were specially interested in yards enjoying the high government subsidies permitted by the EC, like Britain's. Kværner's shipbuilding director, now retired, led the bid. Over the opposition of John Lister, whose corporate plan had just recommended against selling yards off piecemeal, the DTI arranged for him to visit British shipbuilders.
A visit from our side was accepted, and we did visit 2 sites, Sunderland and Govan in Glasgow.
Were you not aware that Mr. Lister did not wish to sell a yard because he feared that selling off Govan would lead to the breakup of British shipbuilders?
Well, I must admit that I was, at that point in time, fully aware of his position, because he told that openly. But the internal discussions between the various parties in British shipbuilders and between British shipbuilders and your government, that was none of our business.
In their approach to Govan, the Norwegians came across a man who was to play a critical and controversial role in what followed, Eric Mackey, Govan's general manager. Mackey was determined to save the last merchant shipbuilder on the Clyde, so he pulled off the trick of negotiating on behalf of the Norwegians. This despite still working for British shipbuilders and the objections of his boss, the chairman, John Lister.
British shipbuilders were not too happy when I was asked to negotiate on behalf of Kværner, and they gave me a blank no. I wasn't allowed to do it. I knew I'd bang up my old friend Graham Day and said to Graham, look, these people want me to negotiate on their behalf. And I said, I've been told I can't do it. He said, well, do it, Eric. He said, if you feel it's right, you go ahead and do it. He said, and I'll have a word with Clark. And he did.
That was Kenneth Clark?
Kenneth Clark.
And then for Lord Young?
Yes. And then the word came back to me that I could go ahead and do it.
Wasn't that a bit odd to go behind the back, if you like, of chairman of British shipbuilders?
One would say that I'm an odd person in a way because I'm a rebel at heart. Maybe that's because I'm an Ulsterman or an Irishman or whatever you like to be. But I believe that if you're going to fight for a yard, you use every trick because they'll use every trick against you.
Having used his political connections to outmaneuver British shipbuilders, Mackey moved into the horse trading and represented Kværner across the table against his own boss, John Lister.
When we went in, first of all, he was sitting opposite Kværner to do the negotiation, and he welcomed us to the table, and he said, well, gentlemen, the first thing you've got to ask for is, well, how much do you want to pay for it? And because I was the spokesman, I just turned around and looked him straight in the face, and I said, nothing. And then shortly thereafter, he said, well, I will leave that to other people to negotiate, and got up and walked out.
Did you get it for nothing?
Oh, no, we didn't get it for nothing. We didn't pay an awful lot for it. And on record, it's supposed to be $6 million that we paid for it.
But how much did you get from the government?
Oh, I would say the whole deal must have been somewhere around about 12 million pounds, somewhere around about this type of thing, to help with the modernisation of the yard and so forth.
So you paid 6, got 12 back. That was a good deal.
Yeah, good deal, yeah.
Released from
the government grant to the Norwegians wasn't the end of it. In total subsidies, it cost the British taxpayer even more to have Govan put in foreign hands. At the end of the day, did you get a good bargain, do you think?
Well, we were satisfied with the agreement that we had made. But you have to remember that shipbuilding, that's a long-term business. So it is difficult to say if this is a bargain or not. But I can say that we were satisfied with the deal that we made at that point in time.
If the Govan deal satisfied Kværner, Lord Young and Kenneth Clark were delighted. Govan's miracle sale, as they called it, was the opportunity to rid themselves of all the nationalised shipyards, big and small. Without further consulting Parliament or the industry, British shipbuilders were now told their corporate plan was dead. They were to prepare instead for the bit-by-bit privatisation John Lister had just recommended against. Lister was indignant as he made clear in evidence to a Common Select Committee at the time. Asked if he'd been prepared to preside over the fragmentation of British shipbuilders, Lister replied, I wouldn't have joined if I'd thought that for a moment. I thought my job was to turn it round and make it viable.
He found in the fullness of time that Ken Clark didn't want him to save the British shipbuilding industry. He wanted him to flog it off. This didn't appeal to him very much indeed. He said to me apropos that, and talking about his evidence to the Select Committee, I thought I should have resigned, he said.
Well, I think he realised that his plan for the industry was now in ruins, in tatters. I mean, after all, he put forward a plan based on the future of a viable British shipbuilding industry, which had involved Govan and NESO. And now there was to be no Govan, therefore the plan could literally be torn up.
It was now that Lord Young's and Kenneth Clark's plans faced a problem. Because merchant shipbuilding is heavily subsidised in all EC countries, Govan's sale had to be cleared by the European Commission. The DTI knew it would take massive state subsidies to get British shipbuilders off its hands, so to allow subsidised privatisations to continue, Lord Young's men badly needed a deal with Brussels. No one knows more about Lord Young's problems than his old colleague Sir Leon Britton, now the lead commissioner on state aids and competition. The Commission needed to satisfy themselves that in the rush to privatise British shipbuilders, the British government was playing by the Brussels competition rules.
What it's about, essentially, is competition. You have got to be sure that one country's firm is not adversely affected by another country that is providing unfair competition. Therefore, the question of state aid is looked at very, very closely and scrutinised very closely.
The DTI brought the governed sale to Brussels for approval here at the offices of DG4, the community's watchdog on state aids and competition. It's the Eurocrats' job to ensure no government cheats by going over the agreed EC limits with too much state subsidy. Officials here felt they had good reason to be on their guard against British creative accountancy. The scrutiny in Brussels of the governed sale raised not a few Euro eyebrows. Officials here were suspicious of Lord Young's men trying unfairly to get round the European community's limits on state subsidies by selling off assets like Govan bit by bit and quietly shifting all the liabilities and all the losses into a single state-owned company. That, they decided here, couldn't go on. So the Commission insisted that all further British shipbuilders' privatisations would have to come in a single final package. It was a deal that did not bode well for Sunderland. While Sunderland continued launching, what no one could be aware of was the threat from the Brussels deal. The Commission would only allow the DTI to exceed the EC limits on state subsidies to British shipbuilders, provided there was a closure, in line with community policy, to reduce the number of subsidised yards in Europe. John Lister sensed that Sunderland was the only candidate.
Mr. Lister, at quite an early stage, after the intention to privatise had been announced, came to Sunderland and met a range of people. And I think it's safe to say this now. Mr. Lister established at the time that no journalists were present and then said he'd speak very frankly. And in the course of that meeting, I think the words that all of us remember very clearly were Mr. Lister saying, "A bloody great steamroller is rolling towards Sunderland, and there's not a lot that I or you can do to stop it."
But even as the Brussels deal was being concluded, Lister and Sunderland suddenly gained a surprise champion. A new minister replaced Kenneth Clarke at the DTI. Tony Newton had a very different approach. He spent a whole day visiting the yards and clearly sympathised with the local campaign to keep Sunderland open.
Having almost given up hope, along came Tony Newton, who appeared, at any rate, to be very, very sincere in his desire to maintain shipbuilding on the river after he had seen it for the first time.
But despite the campaign, this first effort in the autumn of '88 to find buyers for Sunderland quickly came to nothing. Tony Newton decided that the tenders weren't suitable and regretfully announced the yard's closure.
North East Shipbuilders in Sunderland is to close. The decision was confirmed today by the Trade and Industry Minister, Tony Newton.
At the time, there was no mention of a Brussels deal. Sunderland was given government grants for training and new business, but its 600-year history of shipbuilding ended, with 2,000 jobs gone in the yards and many more affected among suppliers.
There was clearly a dreadful feeling that this appalling prospect that we had been facing had finally come about. So it was a real death blow, and it had that feeling in the town.
But as the skeleton staff kept the yard's doom cranes working in routine care and maintenance, there occurred a final extraordinary twist in the story. For after the Christmas '88 closure, unexpectedly a series of buyers did come forward, and the Minister, Tony Newton, again gave encouragement.
If somebody comes forward with a proposal for unsubsidised shipbuilding or ship conversion or ship repair, then it's simply a matter for them to negotiate with British shipbuilders and the viability of that proposal. If they wanted to go back to subsidised shipbuilding on the Weir, that would raise a number of difficulties which we should have to discuss with the European Commission.
Newton's go-ahead for unsubsidised shipbuilding for 6 months raised hopes the Sunderland yards could be saved, with market forces to the rescue.
I think the interesting thing is that John Lister was proved right, that the government got the timing wrong. They forced a closure at a time when there were no serious bidders around, but within a matter of months the market had shown signs of picking up further, and there was renewed interest.
The bidders were established firms, the German shipping company Oldendorf and a London-based Anglo-Greek consortium of shipowners known as Transman Shipping and Charterwell Maritime. Crucially, Both bidders were prepared to build ships without subsidy, if necessary.
We thought that coming forward with very substantial funds and very substantial interest, because they are big ship owners, my clients, needing for repairs, conversion and new buildings, that we were welcomed with open arms. We did put in a lot of work. We put in a business plan. My clients' financial resources were investigated and found to be absolutely superb, and we were encouraged to develop it.
As the business plans were assessed inside British shipbuilders' Knightsbridge headquarters, a revitalised John Lister now saw a real chance of saving Sunderland.
John was very enthusiastic. He had done a lot of negotiating. There was hardly a minute of the day when his office wasn't full of people. One minute it would be Alan Dickinson of Clarkson's, another time it would be somebody from Oldendorf. He would say to me, without mentioning names or whatever, "Don't you think it's a great idea? I've had a great morning," he would say. "Great morning. There's a chap in here who wants to take over and he wants to build so-and-so. What do you think of that? No? Good idea, hmm?"
Negotiations were finalised. Lister's board of directors expected him to recommend a preferred bidder to the DTI.
And so what, to your knowledge, was Mr. Lister proposing to do?
I believe he was going to propose to the government to accept one of the bids.
You had the feeling that there was a kind of short list of the bidders and that you were rather well placed on it?
Oh, we most certainly thought we were well placed, and we think that there were just two going in as shipbuilders, which is Oldendorf and ourselves.
And that's exactly what Lister told the Commons Trade and Industry Committee in June '89. To all concerned, it seemed that Sunderland was about to be saved in a matter of days.
You're hoping that whatever negotiation you have, you might be able to wrap up before the end of the 30th of June, before
Yes.
the 30th of June. Have I got it right?
Well, I would certainly hope to be in a position to recommend a preferred bidder by the end of June.
They seem to have absolutely everything they'd ever been looking for. And in the sense, on top of that, ideologically, it was wonderful for them. I mean, here was an entrepreneur who wanted to buy a shipyard, build ships without any subsidy. It would have been the first major merchant yard in Britain to do it, the first major merchant yard in Europe to do it. I mean, in a sense, it was a Thatcherite dream. And, I mean, we would expected in a way that Tony Newton would have got on the first plane to Brussels and had it agreed.
On June 27, '89, Tony Newton did go to Brussels. Accompanied by his senior civil servant, he brought with him the finalised shipbuilding bids for Sunderland. The men from Lord Young's Department for Enterprise had an appointment with the Competition and State Aids Commissioner, Leon Britton. Even though they were proposing unsubsidised shipbuilding, they discovered they still needed EC approval to reopen an officially closed yard. As the ministerial party drove towards the Commission's headquarters, they knew there would be some tough bargaining ahead. But they might also have reflected that the minister was on the brink of a personal political triumph. The reopening of a shipyard under new private ownership, the saving of hundreds of jobs, and all done without any new state subsidy. But awaiting the minister was a devastating surprise. Leon Britton, who'd been appointed since the earlier negotiation, had also prepared himself well for this meeting. He was to spell out to Tony Newton the true implications of a secret deal the DTI's civil servants had struck with Brussels the previous December. At this meeting, Newton was to learn that all the work he and the bidders had put into saving Sunderland had been a waste of time. We can reveal that the confidential briefing note prepared for Sir Leon's meeting with Mr. Newton explained that to strike the earlier deal, British officials had effectively committed the government to closing Sunderland. That had been the real price for the Commission's approval for the over-subsidising of the other privatisations. This key document reads, the closure of North East shipbuilders was a determining factor in the approval. The British government were free to apply to open Sunderland again, but that, the document said, must therefore imply a complete reopening of the case, including the aid granted to the companies already sold off.
When the question of the opening of the shipyard arose, it wasn't for me to say you can't do it. That's
No,
not the
I
power of
appreciate
the Commission. I did have to say, as part of the deal was that there was a certain amount of aid given on certain terms. If part of that deal was now going by the board, I would have to come to the Commission and say, well, now what do we do about this aid? Do we ask for it to be paid back?
During the meeting, Britain pointed out that closure meant closure for unsubsidized as well as subsidized shipbuilding. Unravelling the deal could be a lengthy business, with a legal procedure in which other EC members could crawl over the books. Reopening Sunderland meant that all the subsidies and all the massaging of British shipbuilders' figures would be open to challenge. It was a bitter conclusion. And there might be potentially embarrassing questions about the subsidies used to sweeten the other sell-offs, starting with Govan.
When you said to them, it's going to require undoing the package, I mean, you must have had a pretty clear idea in your mind that it was going to be a rather large process that would perhaps unravel all sorts of things.
Oh, certainly. It would unravel, well, not all sorts of things. It would unravel that which had been agreed the previous December, no more, but no less. When you say unravel it, I didn't have in mind and couldn't have had in mind that all of that would be disallowed. You couldn't possibly say that, but all of that was put in question, would have been put in question if they'd have gone down that route.
I mean, might it, in your view, have included the Govan deal, where they sold
Well,
off
I
the
don't think
Govan
I'm going to go into exactly what it might or might not have included. Everything that was agreed in December would have been called in question.
As he drove away, the obvious question for Tony Newton was why he wasn't aware of all this during the months he was encouraging the new bids for Sunderland. It's never been answered satisfactorily. Both Newton and his boss at DTI, Lord Young, as the cabinet ministers directly involved, have declined our requests for interviews on the grounds they've moved on from these responsibilities. But to those who saw him after his Brussels meeting, Tony Newton seemed a shaken man.
Back came Tony Newton from that meeting absolutely devastated, and indeed, you know, for a cabinet minister, remarkably making no secret of the fact he was absolutely devastated.
Now,
and he'd been told, none of this is on. If you want to reopen even one yard in Sunderland, we will have a procedure which will take months on end, and we will reopen the entire original closure package. We will freeze all the remedial measures while we're doing this, and this clearly came as a great shock to Tony Newton.
Newton was now in a quandary. If he did nothing, Sunderland would have to stay closed under EC rules for at least 5 years. Yet saving Sunderland risked jeopardizing the other shipbuilding privatizations by clawing back much of the aid paid out since Govan. The Brussels deal had become Pandora's box. One potential source of embarrassment to the government was the December '88 privatisation of British shipbuilders' engine makers on the Clyde, Clark Kincaid. Here there was at least one particular financial arrangement which the EC say wasn't disclosed to them, and without which the privatisation would not have gone ahead as planned. It happened like this. DTI officials, we're told, encouraged 3 British shipbuilders' executives to stage a management buyout of Clark Kincaid. The managers agreed. They would buy the engine works, but only if it came with an engine order from Kverna, who just moved into Govan further up the Clyde. The problem was the Norwegians, through their manager Eric Mackey, had already signed a letter of intent to order engines from a cheaper Polish firm. To go private, Kincaids had to match the price.
There was no doubt whatsoever they weren't going to get the engines from us unless we got them at the right price. And that was absolutely clear. So if they hadn't got help to do that, then it would be very difficult for Kincaids to be sold.
With Kincaids, the DTI faced an 11th hour choice: subsidise the engines or see the privatisation collapse. Top British and Norwegian sources have told us that the decision made was to use a hidden sweetener to ensure the privatisation went through. Using a straight cash subsidy was feared likely to fall foul of the European Commission, So instead, the DTI authorised British shipbuilders to use an indirect subsidy by reducing the price they were asking for Kincaid's. The managers would have to pay less to buy the privatised company so that they in turn could drop the price of the engines and clinch the Norwegian order.
It was a tough competition at that point where the yard had tenders from different main engine manufacturers, from Clark Kincaid's as well as from Sulzer and others. Finally, we were presented with an arrangement, with a price where the engines were subsidized by your government to such a level that they could compete with the foreign prices.
So how come you didn't buy from the Poles in the end?
Because we got the best price from, we got an equal price from Kincaid's.
And how was that brought about?
That, I think you would have to ask Kincaid's that one, because I don't think they could have built the engines for that price. But I think that they got help from British shipbuilders to be able to build those engines for us.
Wasn't it in fact a condition of their privatisation that they had to have a workload, and that the only workload going was your ships in this yard?
Possibly that very much would have been the case. That's where I think that British shipbuilders helped them in getting that workload, and the best way to get the workload was to help them with the price of the engines.
I mean, when you say British shipbuilders,
I mean the government.
Of course it was the British government.
Well, we always looked on British shipbuilders as our banker, and of course we always, we don't say the government give us this money, they give it to us indirectly through British shipbuilders, of course.
We asked Kincaid's first managing director, Bill Scott, about this, but he declined to be interviewed. DTI sources maintain it was all down to British shipbuilders, and they declined comment on commercial confidentiality. Kincaid's is but one example of the many complicated deals rushed through to get British shipbuilders privatised. All were tied to the closure of Sunderland. Faced with Kincaid's and all the other sell-offs, Newton and Young rapidly decided they didn't wish to reopen the Brussels deal. Yet Newton was in a delicate situation. Sunderland was expecting the yards to reopen, and British shipbuilders was on the point of recommending its favoured bidder, the last thing Newton now needed. So John Lister was summoned to the DTI for a meeting kept secret from his other directors. He was instructed now not to recommend anything, but instead produce a neutral assessment of the Sunderland bids and get the government off the hook. John Moore met Lister shortly afterwards.
Almost immediately from the state of euphoria which you mentioned, or anticipated euphoria which we had, I went in to see John, as was my wont, in the morning, and he looked very depressed indeed. He said, "I think I've been made a fall guy." I said, "Why?" He said, "I understand that some arrangement has been come to in Brussels, which is going to mean that all the work we've put into trying to sell Northeast shipbuilders is no longer of any value at all."
I think we were all shocked. It was totally unexpected. And I think it was a very great shock to him. He said to me, I mean, we've all been wasting our time for the last 6 months. I think he was extremely bitter.
And of course, shortly afterwards, he died.
Yes, I suppose it was approximately a month later. I think he'd been deeply wounded, and I think the wound was mortal.
John Lister's death at 61 seemed to set the seal on an extraordinary series of events. The Commons Trade and Industry Committee has investigated some of the issues raised in this programme, although the government still refuses to release details of the privatisation deals on commercial grounds. Committee Chairman Kenneth Warren is still pondering the central question: was it just a shame or a scandal?
Well, what is the difference between a shame and a scandal, in the sense that it is a pity, and I speak as the background of an engineer, to see good men and good facilities taken out of the market when the market itself is growing. So it's a scandal in the sense that I don't think people have really realized what they were doing at the time that the closure was confirmed and renegotiation was written out of any part of the government policy. That's the pity. I think we can't afford to throw away national assets.
Were you surprised that the government didn't exercise that option to renegotiate? Because it was clearly there. It wasn't the EEC stopping us, was it?
I was disappointed that they didn't. I think the whole Select Committee was disappointed. But the government was adamant, and the government runs the country, and that was that. More's the pity. After all, Sunderland had some of the very finest shipbuilding facilities in the whole of the Western world. And we went out there, had a look at them, and I felt sorry to think that this is just going to be swept away by bulldozers.
In a cruel parody of the enterprise culture, Sunderland lost its shipbuilding. The jewel of the modern construction hall can't even be sold by the DTI to the catamaran builder.
Just what we were really looking for. And it was obviously redundant at the time. It had all the craneage and the facilities, and obviously all that we would have needed to add to this was a smallish office block.
So a British shipbuilder who can't find a suitable site in this country is taking his enterprise and the jobs abroad.
I just think it's terribly disappointing, and really it's quite disgusting that this business effectively is going to be taken out of the UK.
Sunderland is trying to pick itself up with a brighter image. There's an annual municipal festival of illuminations to attract sightseers. And there's work to be had in the car plant, which Lord Young enticed to Sunderland, though the jobs are more likely to go to the children of Sunderland shipyard workers than the men themselves. The government has not left Sunderland without compensations. A junior minister celebrated the extension of an enterprise zone, part of a £45 million package of grants. But so far, the extension has attracted only a handful of new jobs.
Come out and talk to us, man! Come out! I'm one of the unemployed.
More jobs are promised, but for some local people and their Labour MP, the campaign continues for ministers and officials to be brought to account.
This is a study in complete lack of accountability, in the relationship between officials and ministers, officials in Brussels and commissioners, and the way in which, half by cock-up and half by conspiracy and deceit, decisions are made that affect thousands of people's livelihood and the whole future of an industry in this country without anyone ever really explaining how the decision is being made or being held accountable afterwards.
Conspiracy theories and cock-up theories, I usually find it's a cock-up, not a conspiracy.
And in this case?
I say it was a cock-up.
The government's case is that the best deal was done for taxpayers. No more of their money is being poured away to meet shipbuilding's losses. But the unanswered question is why this, of all governments, wouldn't allow private enterprise to take its own risks, to save from destruction what was the last major merchant shipbuilder in England.